Okay, it's late here, so I'm not going to make this video very long, but something I want to talk about. I've just come across a video talking about supposedly how racist Israelis are, and it's a video about how racist they are towards Arabs in Israel. I think that's a contentious issue. I think racism can be found in Israel, it can be found in every country, but there is definitely an online agenda to try and vilify the nation of Israel, and to try and portray Israelis as somehow more racist than other people. I think that's a deeply flawed claim. There is definitely examples to be found of racism within Israel, but you can find that in any society on earth. You could pick up pockets of racist gangs in just about any country. This is nothing to do with racism that does exist in Israel. This is more to do with vilifying the state of Israel for a political agenda. I really believe that's what it's about. Israel is a country that is very far from perfect, but Arab Israelis can rise to high positions. There are Arab Israeli judges, Arab Israeli politicians, and nothing, as far as I know, is stopping them assuming those positions. Now, I'm not saying that discrimination doesn't exist in Israel. I'm not saying there aren't far-right Orthodox Jews who are bigoted against anyone who doesn't conform to their ideology. I'm not doubting there are neo-nationalists, just like you get in every country. But what really bothers me here is that Israel is singled out in a way that seems incredibly hypocritical, especially when it comes from Arab sources. And I say hypocritical because, in a lot of Arab countries, it's okay, it's openly a fact that, for example, the Holocaust, the Jewish Shoah, is mocked in cartoons. And nothing happens about that. There's no laws against it. And there's very little official condemnation of that. And very often criticism of Israel descends into outright anti-Jewish hatred. I've just come off a thread where I've seen the Jews take the land, the Jews should be wiped off the land, the Jews this, the Jews that. It's not about Israel the country, it's about Jews the people. So there's a very thin line between criticism of Israel and criticism of the Jews as a people. I used to say that criticism of Israel is entirely legitimate, and I still say it is. I've never argued that Israel is above criticism, never, and I never will argue that. However, what I want to say in this video, and like I said, it's late, so I won't make this very long. There will never be peace in the Holy Land until Arabs accept that Israel is not going anywhere. It's just not. You can argue about the rights and wrongs of how Israel was established, and I think that's a very long and complex debate, because the history of the Holy Land is ancient, and history did not begin in the Holy Land in 1948. That, I believe, is a distortion. You don't have to be an expert to realise that. Jews have been in that land long before the Second World War, so the idea that they just come in and stole it is a bit of a distortion. I'm aware that thousands, millions of Palestinians were displaced, and I'm aware it's a contentious issue. Okay, there's a debate to be had about that, but this debate is never going to be solved by simply saying Israel should not exist. It's just not going to happen. Israel's not going anywhere. The state of Israel is not going anywhere. And until Arabs learn to accept that fact, then there isn't going to be peace. And even, people on the left of this argument have accepted that the two-state solution is one approach towards peace. Now, I'm not uncritical of Israel. I think the settlement building, for example, is a big mistake. I think it's morally wrong, and I do think it's a big mistake. It's not going to help Israel in terms of international opinion. And there are Israeli right-wingers who are not being very practical at the moment. But in terms of Israel, the country, one thing that's not discussed here is the fact that Arab children are brainwashed from a very early age to hate Israel and Israelis. This is a form of child abuse as far as I'm concerned. And you get people as far away as Morocco, thousands of miles from the Holy Land, who are from an early age taught to hate Israel. You get Muslims in Indonesia taught to hate Israel. And all because of the Palestinian issue. Now there is injustices there. There is rights and wrongs on both sides. And I'm not going to say in this video Israel's entirely right. Israel has had blood on its hands. But what really bothers me is how Israel is singled out in a world of injustice. Why is it Israel is so vilified as a nation? I would argue hugely disproportionately so. When you consider some of the injustices that go on in this world, and when you get networks like Al Jazeera, which blatantly has a biased agenda against the state of Israel, it's very difficult to see how, it's actually easy to see where this bias comes from. Israel is, I would argue, the world's most disproportionately vilified country. And that's not me saying that it's above criticism. That's me saying that when you look at things in context, it is definitely disproportionate. If you consider, for example, the number of people who have died in the Holy Land in the past decade, it's around 10,000. Now, I'm not trivializing it, it's a serious issue, but look at the war in the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo. 4.5 million people, no, up to 5.4 million people have died from war and war-related disease, i.e. lack of medical care brought about by wartime conditions in the DRC in the same time. Now, why does Al Jazeera not devote time to that? And there's plenty of other conflicts. Look at Burma, where as many as 10,000 Muslims in the Rakhine state died in the last few weeks of 2012. Why does that not get attention in the Arab media? If this is all about Muslim suffering, i.e. supposed empathy with the Palestinians, why is it Muslim suffering in other parts of the world doesn't get the same sort of attention? Why is it Muslim suffering in Chechnya or Xinjiang in China, where there's arguably repression? I think there's an agenda here. The agenda is to vilify the state of Israel disproportionately. And I think there's massive hypocrisy here. Now, I'm not saying there isn't injustices against the Palestinians, and I'm not saying Israel is above criticism. I'm not saying that. But you'd have to be... it doesn't take a genius to work out there is something seriously warped about the way the media presents this, especially Arab media. And I would argue it's massively disproportionate to what actually happens. Partly, also, it's wrong because a lot of the suffering the Palestinians experience are because of the judgment of the Palestinian leadership and infighting, actually. Israel has made steps towards peace, and they have been thanked with that by rocket attacks. It makes me depressed that people cannot... They seem to be so blinded by their hatred of Israel that they cannot see that there is two sides to this conflict. There's this caricature of Israel, this big overbearing bully, but actually how I see Israel is a David surrounded by hostile Goliaths, including, by the way, some pretty powerful countries like Egypt, like Turkey, like Iran. They're not small countries, they're powerful countries. I'd say equal to Israel in terms of military capabilities. Of course Israel's propped up by the United States, but that's only because if it wasn't, it would possibly be wiped off the face of the earth. These are serious questions. And until there's leadership in the Arab world that accepts, yes, we'll criticize Israel, but we accept that Israel is here to stay, then there is not going to be peace in this part of the world. I'm not saying that Israel is above criticism. And I'm not saying Arab states shouldn't criticise Israel, but until they acknowledge that Israel is not going anywhere. I mean, you can hate Israel till you're blue in the face, but thinking that it's going to leave is just irrational. You know, I hate the Communist Party in China, but I acknowledge that it's there and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I hate the repression that they cause, but I still acknowledge the People's Republic of China is a fact. And you have to work with facts. You can't just wish that something is not there. Now, what I see in a lot of Arab media and a lot of online vitriol is this avalanche of hatred against the state of Israel. And supposedly it's about the repression that the Israelis cause against the Palestinians, but I think the real issue here is an agenda by Arab media to distort the whole picture and only show one side. Now, it may be true that there have been more Palestinians killed than Israelis. Yeah, that's true. But Israelis have been killed. Innocent Israelis have been killed. That's a fact. There isn't really much more I can add to this, but I think it's just... By the way, if people call me a blind Zionist or something like that, whatever, I don't care. Someone has to speak out and say there's a massive amount of propaganda that is... I just don't understand why one country can be vilified so much when we live in a world of injustice, and far worse things happen in this world than what is happening in the Holy Land. As bad as that is, everyone knows the situation in the Palestinian territories is no picnic, and Israel does bear some responsibility for that, of course. But it's just a perverse distortion that one country could be so vilified. I'm just plugging in a battery here because I'm low on power. It bothers me that so much of the debate about this conflict is taken up by the very existence of Israel. It's just a phony argument. And so long as that is the focus from the Arab side, there's not going to be peace. There just isn't. Because Israeli people, you know, there's plenty of Israelis who disagree with their own government and its policies, but those people will still not... They'll say that the idea that Israel should be gone is just perverse. And it's not just to do with the Holocaust. That's a very significant thing, but it wasn't just the Holocaust. Jewish people suffered centuries of persecution, whether it be the pogroms in Russia or medieval persecution in Europe. They suffered centuries of persecution, and they had a right to establish a homeland. That's a fact. Now, the origins of that homeland and the fact that Palestinians were uprooted is always going to be a cause of debate. But tell me one country that has a perfect origin. If you look at most countries in the world, their origins, most of them have high controversial origins. Here in the UK, the English-Scottish Union has had controversial origins. But it's here to stay. Well, hopefully it is. The point I'm trying to make here is that the focus of Israeli existence is just so stupid. It's so... Taking it from that angle is just... It's not going to change a damn thing. And not only is it vitriolic, but it's stupid. It's stupid. The state of Israel is not going anywhere. The only way that Israel is going to go is if there was some sort of massive nuclear attack. And that's incomprehensible, because if any state dared do that, they would know that Western powers would swoop in and defend Israel, because we would have to. It would be our moral obligation to do that. Britain and the United States, and probably France, would not tolerate a situation whereby Israel suffered that sort of massive attack. Therefore, I would say to our people watching this, you could disagree with Israeli policy, fine. But Israel, the country, is not going to go. It's just not.